Okay, this is the last of the three lectures about the Middle Ages, and this one is kind of quick and dirty. There's a lot of information here that we simply can't cover. I'm just kind of giving you the broad brushstrokes, and there'll be more in the readings. I will get the readings posted. I'm having trouble with my scanner, but they'll follow along. You'll have more than enough time before the next exam to do all the readings. All right, so by the end of the Middle Ages, all of the structures of society are fully formed. And these kind of levels, if you will, of society are an idea that comes from Alfred the Great, we've talked about before. And he believed that everyone had a clear place in society and comes up with this three-tiered structure. And this is actually a pretty good and obvious way of describing uh, Western society this time. And essentially what the traditional orders are doing is they're describing everyone's relationship to power, meaning who is up and who is down. Those that pray were not meant to toil in the field, but they're meant to concern themselves with religious problems. In fact, land is given to the religious orders so that they can have a level of independence from secular influence, kind of taking care of themselves. Now, how well that actually works is open to debate because the church gets into a lot of politics in this time period. And of course, those that fight are the knights. These are members of the nobility. Many of them are male children that are not going to come to the throne, and they're absorbed into either monastic orders, the priesthood, or into knighthood. And a lot of the societies of knights are actually based on religious orders, and you get things like the Knights Templar, which I'm sure you've heard about before, and there's a whole culture that revolves around the knights that has influenced our understanding in this time period, and we get these ideas of things like chivalry, um, watching out for taking care of the poor, and things like that. And despite all these ideals that circulate around the ideas of the knighthood, these are still men whose job is extreme violence. All right, the nobility and the knighthood are totally dependent on what's called the feudal system. And the feudal system is constituted by those who work. And it is essentially, the feudal system is essentially the same over time with only minor changes and modifications to the way that it operates. And the system is strongly self reinforcing. And basically, land is controlled by a lord or a noble or somebody of power, and this land is called a fief. So each noble or lord would have his own little fiefdom, and the people on this land are beholden to that noble and work the land. And the noble is responsible for its defense and defense of the people that are on it. Men that come into the system use the land to pay for a military lifestyle, pay for crusading, things of that nature. The first sons usually end up with the house and properties, fiefdoms, things of that nature. But the second and third sons often end up as soldiers because they're not going to inherit. They're not going to become part of this landholding system. So they end up being the ones that go into uh, the priesthood or becoming knights and fighting for anyone that can afford them. The folks that are actually working out in the field are called serfs. Now, this is not slavery, although the distinction is admittedly very fine. And the key features of the serf is that they are all poor, they've got low social status, and have almost no economic or political power. And a version of this system exists right on up into the 20th century in Russia. Now, internal violence and chaos, political chaos, is a feature of this time period. And it affects all of the orders, and it affects um, religious orders just as much as it does kings and political order. There is a great schism in the church in this time period. Basically, Philip IV of France attempts to kidnap or pope nap the Pope, which is Boniface VIII, the Eighth, and this is a political struggle between the secular power of kings versus the spiritual power of the Catholic Church. And if you'll think about it, this goes all the way back to the ideas of Charlemagne, and Charlemagne being the king and having power on the earth, etc. And in Philip IV's case, this is a bold attempt to physically control the Pope and gain authority over religious appointments and taxation. And after the death of Boniface VIII, there is a time where the popes live in France rather than Rome. Um, France replaces Boniface VIII with Clement V, and he is chosen by the French. So they kind of install their own sympathetic guy. And these popes that are living in France rather than Rome are actually close to the French king and thus subject to the authority of the French court. Pope Gregory XI attempts to return to Rome, and this is after some time has gone by, but Pope Gregory XI attempts to return to Rome, but dies in the process. And what follows is a crisis of succession within the church itself. Pope Urban VI is elected in the normal way, and France does not approve of this selection. He's not kind of reliably pro-French. And so they, meaning the French, elect Clement VII. And the problem is now there are two popes, and both of these popes are claiming total religious authority for all of Christianity. And in a system where the pope has these powers that we've talked about before, where he can interdict whole countries and severely damage your personal relationship with God, this is a big deal, because who do you follow? Who do you listen to? Who actually has the authority? And the cardinals of the Catholic Church are disgusted by this, and they actually elect yet another pope, John the 23rd. And so not only you don't just end up with the two popes, you eventually end up with three. And in 1414, the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund says, enough of this. This is ridiculous. He calls the Council of Constance in Germany. And the purpose of this council is to sort out exactly who is the Pope and who has this authority. And at this council, they get rid of all three of the new popes and select a final pope, Martin V. And the kings declare that their power comes straight from God, and therefore that they are able to dictate to the pope. And this calls into question the papal claim to supreme power that we've seen before, but it does ensure that there won't be any more crises over who is actually going to be pope anytime in the future. England convulses with multiple wars and crises of succession in this time as well. There's a great effort to consolidate power in Europe, and England and France fight constantly in their efforts to do so. Edward II is the son of Edward the Longshanks that we talked about last time, and Edward II is useless in battle, and he's weak and is eventually deposed by his own wife in preference for his son, Edward III. Edward III creates a problem with France because he declares himself King of France, and he looks back in history and claims hereditary titles to lands that are in France. Obviously, the French king and the French kingdoms don't agree with this, and it starts what is known, or what becomes known, as the 100 Years' War. And essentially, if you boil it down to its basic elements, the 100 Years' War is really just an ongoing attempt to resolve issues of hereditary title and succession. And this is kind of an unfortunate byproduct of the feudal system. 100 Years' War starts small, with England raiding into France and avoiding any pitched battles with France, where the superior number of French troops could have an impact on battle. But over time, France learns on the battlefield and gets better at fighting. And as France gets better at fighting, the expense of running the war dramatically increases. It increases to the point where it actually brings down Richard III, and he is replaced by Henry IV. Henry IV, his son, which is Henry V, kind of an unimaginative name, but nevertheless, returns to this idea that France belongs to England. And he attacks France, fighting with French King Charles VI. And Henry V has much better success on the battlefield than all of the kings before him, and he actually defeats Charles at the Battle of um, Agincourt in 1415. And by the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, the sons of Charles VI, these would be potential French heirs to the throne, are their their right to the throne is taken away by agreement in the treaty. So they're kind of declared null. And Henry V, an English king, is declared heir apparent to the French throne. And, the Hundred Year Wars at this point is essentially wrapped up very nicely, except both Charles VI and Henry V drop dead in 1422. And when Henry V drops dead, France is able to exploit this kind of power vacuum to begin the reconquest of France. Fighting again falls on the shoulders of the sons of these kings, and in this case, Charles VII of France and Henry VI of England. And Charles VII is greatly helped along the way by a peasant girl, and her name is Joan of Arc, and she claims that she is on a mission from God. And she claims that she receives visions from God telling her to lead the French army. What she does is she provides a source of inspiration for the French military, and France kind of reverses the course of the Hundred Year War yet again. So Charles is basically using Joan of Arc as a tool in his efforts to retake France. And it is true that the English eventually captured Joan of Arc and burned her at the stake as a heretic. Now, whether or not she was crazy or inspired by God is completely irrelevant, as the importance is her effect on the French military had the proper effect. And France is able to take back almost all of the gains lost to England um, in prior years. In fact, the last battle of the Hundred Years' War was fought in 1450. Now, France gets a little bit of a breather at this time. England is plunged into chaos almost immediately. Henry VI loses everything during the war, and when I say loses everything, I mean all of the land in France, except for Calais, which is right across the English Channel from England. It's right on the French coast. And there sparks an internal war here over who should be king, and this war is called the War of the Roses. And Richard of York and his son Edward get rid of Henry VI. And Edward becomes King Edward IV, but then he drops dead. And his brother Richard, also son of Richard of York, steps in to help the son of Edward IV, who eventually becomes Edward V. Now, Richard is a pretty savvy guy. He decides and he says, I want to keep the kids safe. So what we're going to do is we're going to take Edward V, who's now King of England, and we're going to take him and his brother, which are the direct heirs to the throne of England, and we're going to put them in the Tower of London for safekeeping. And once they go into the Tower of London, they are never seen or heard from again. So they're kind of killed off by Richard III. By Richard. Now, once he gets rid of Edward's sons, Richard becomes Richard III, King of England, and that's all fine and good, except he is immediately killed by Henry Tudor. Now, Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VII upon the death of Richard III, founds the Tudor dynasty. And the Tudor dynasty is a series of rulers and powerful figures that have a profound impact on the religious and social history of the Western civilization. In fact, if you trace it back just far enough, they have a direct influence on folks coming to the New World in New England and setting up religious colonies. We'll get to that later, though. Now, the Tudor dynasty is very important to understand in this time period because it sets you up to understand things that happen later. What you have to know about Henry VII is that he's a very smart guy. And he still believes that France belongs to England. And so what he wants to do is set up some really powerful alliances with other kingdoms against France. So France has just kind of repulsed England and beaten them on the battlefield, basically driven them off the continent except for Calais. And he's going to reach out to some other powerful people and try and make an alliance that he can use against France. And he turns to he turns to Spain and creates an alliance with Ferdinand and Isabella by marrying his eldest son, who is Prince Arthur, to their daughter Catherine of Aragon. And this makes the marriage brings the two countries together, it makes them allies just by virtue of the fact that their children are kind of together. And this is all again sewn up very nicely, but then Arthur drops dead. Isabella and Henry get together and they do a kind of switcheroo with Catherine, and they marry her to Arthur's younger brother, Henry's other son, also named Henry. And that Henry eventually becomes King Henry VIII, and he will be a tremendously important figure you will absolutely have to know about. But this marriage and the switcheroo that's going on here actually makes a lot of sense, particularly if you're a military power like England that has just suffered a bunch of defeats, has had all this political turmoil and civil war. Remember that Spain in this time period has one of the most powerful militaries on the planet. And look at the dates. Think about 1492, right? The end of the Reconquista, a date you're absolutely going to have to remember. And the Reconquista has just ended, just a few years before the marriage of Arthur to Isabella, or excuse me, to Catherine. And the Reconquista has ended, and this whole gigantic military apparatus is available for use. It's not tied up in killing Jews and Muslims in the south of Spain. It could be potentially directed against France if Henry is clever enough to Henry VII is clever enough to turn a alliance to his profit. And I'll tell you that it doesn't work that way, but that is the basic idea behind this marriage and this alliance that follows along with it. All right, while all of the social and political chaos of this time is going on, the most devastating pandemic in history up to that time is unleashed on Europe. And we're talking about plague, the Black Death, Yersinia pestis. And you can actually see the microbe right here in this slide. The plague is a major disruptor because these kings and queens and powerful religious figures are very clever people, and they're able to make alliances and work for their own benefit and do things for their own population. And plague doesn't care. Plague has absolutely no political or religious allegiance, and it just goes on to kill whomever gets infected and can't fight off the infection. And we're talking about somewhere between the neighborhood of 25 to 35 million people, depending on which historian you look at and whose figures you accept. So, even if you just throw out the high end numbers, 35 million, and you go with a low end number, 25 million is a lot of people. That's the kind of territory of people killed in the First World War. It's staggering. And the population in Europe is terrified by this. There are actually places in Europe that are essentially depopulated. This map shows how plague traveled. It travels from the south to the northeast, and this is just a short time period that we're talking about here. Really, 1348 is when the major infections start, and within about 3 years, it spread all the way into northern Europe. And this is following routes of trade and commerce. It is a unfortunate byproduct of long distance trade networks, and it eventually becomes something that just hitches a ride wherever people are going. So as armies are marching back and forth, it follows them. As goods are bartered across the Mediterranean or from the Islamic empires, Constantinople, it travels along with them. No one is really spared. There are areas that have fewer infections, but they're kind of fringe areas with smaller populations to begin with, and they are also extremely cold areas where it's difficult for the disease to transmit itself. And plague does huge damage to the population. So we're talking about 60 something percent or more of the population is killed. And when 60% or more of your population collapses, civic authority ceases to exist. And what you end up with is a situation where not enough people are left to even bury the dead. So it actually contributes to this feedback loop that's going on of transmission of the disease. People are exposed to this. They're, like I said, they're absolutely terrifying, and they begin to ask questions of the church and faith, and how can all of this be explained by a God that loves us Christians, et cetera, et cetera. And not just in sense of the damage it does to civic authority, but also the personal human effects. And everything that the plague does is absolutely horrible. This photograph on the right hand side there is not even close to the worst photograph I can show you of some of the unfortunate side effects of having plague. The disease evolves as it spreads, and it's eventually spread by contact and air, infected vermin, and infections of the blood result in gangrene. And this is where a part of your body has died, but it's still attached, an infection inside. And parts of the body will rot off or just decay, and it's beyond description. And keep in mind that these people have no germ theory. They don't really understand what's going on, and so they're grasping at straws trying to rationalize what's going on. They've got absolutely no way to stop it, no way to fight it, and no way to even really understand it. Now, there is, if you want to look at it this way, a positive effect that comes from the plague. And this is a subject of a lot of debate, but I think it's got some merit. There's plenty of traction to be had here with this idea that, even if 60 something percent of the population dies, 40% still survives. And those that did survive often saw an increase in their wages simply because there was less competition. So as population sharply declined, the people that were immune or caught it and managed to survive um, benefited in ways that were not direct or obvious to them at the time. We can see that as we look back in time as historians. There are many responses to the plague, and one example is the flagellants. That is not flatulence. Flatulence is something else entirely. Um, but these folks go from town to town, beating themselves into bloody pulps, and there's kind of a remission of sin um, going along with this idea. Um, think about your modern guy walking up and down the street with the sign saying "Repent, the end is at hand." This is kind of the same concept, just in a much more graphic and brutal way. And the church responds violently to these movements. And there's other movements that are similar to this, and the church just doesn't have any time for any of them. And these folks become subjected to the Inquisition, and a lot of them are burned at the stake or kind of driven into exile. It's a tragic irony as the fact that survivors are being destroyed in the midst of all of the Black Death um, because they are unable to rationalize except through these dramatic, really dramatic and horrifying exhibitions of spiritual belief. A lot of folks turn against Jews. Jews are rounded up and exiled, and tens of thousands of them are murdered. And so you get religious convulsions of people as they try to understand what is going on all around them. There is one more major stressor, and that is, of course, the encroachment of Islam on the eastern borders of Europe. Remember that Spain is essentially has expelled the Muslims from southern Spain at this time, but that's kind of a military strength in in the far west. We're talking about the east here. And in 1453, Mehmed II attacks and captures Constantinople. And this had been kind of a project that the Muslim conquest had been working on for quite a long time, many, many years. And when Constantinople falls, they of course rename it Istanbul. But Byzantium, this idea of an Eastern Roman Empire, or at least a group of people that are no longer Roman but still self-identify as Roman, Byzantium ceases to exist. And Muslim armies bridge this area in Turkey and begin to come into what would be Turkey today, begin to come into the kind of far eastern edges of Europe itself. And they invade places that we would recognize today. This would be the Balkans and Greece, Bosnia, Serbia, and Wallachia, Moldavia, and of course Transylvania. So there is a tremendous fear among people that if the plague doesn't get me, then I can be absorbed by these Arab conquests and we can be killed or forced to convert to Islam. People are under a great deal of stress from these two dissimilar sources. Now, the Balkans become the location of constant seesaw warfare between these Muslim invaders and a lot of the small Christian kingdoms at the very edge of Europe. And this goes on essentially for almost 900 years. If you consider the beginning of this when uh, Europe kind of lashes out in 1059 at the beginning of the Crusades, and then 1923 would be the destruction of the Ottoman Empire following World War One. Now, the most notable example of this defense, and I only include this because it's a name you'll be sure to recognize, is a king called Vlad Dracula. And in 1462, he stops the army of Mehmed II dead cold in its tracks. And you have to remember that Mehmed II has just conquered Constantinople. This is a something that was not thought possible for many, many, many years. And this king, Dracula, was able to do so with without really engaging in much direct combat. It also illustrates the absolute savagery, the level of destruction that warfare had reached after all of these years and the experience of the Crusades and the religious overtones of combat. As Mehmed II's army had advanced into Europe, they encountered a town where 20,000 men, women, and children were impaled on spikes as a warning to the invaders. And this particular episode, again, stopped the invading army dead in its tracks and they went someplace else for a time. It shows just how brutal that this warfare had become. And it's an episode that's enough to not only it's enough to fix itself in the public history, public consciousness of this history, and it inspires a litany of cinematic and literary homage to Dracula as a figure. And you know exactly who I'm talking about. We don't need to go into that, but we live with this image of Dracula as kind of a ghoul, a barbaric, violent kind of evil figure to this day. And that is entirely subjective because these areas where Vlad was a king revere his memory to this day and treat him as a um, kind of a heroic figure. I don't want to say it, but in much the same way we kind of look up to George Washington as this mythic military figure, they kind of look up to Vlad Dracula in the same way. Obviously, it's different, but I'm making a comparison here, okay? And while these areas, Romania um, and Moldavia and places like that, look up to Vlad Dracula, the Turks can still remember the experience of encountering 20,000 dead people hanging on stakes. And so it's interesting how history can be relative depending on your proximity to the people that you're studying, or looking back reflectively through time. But what I want you to realize is that fighting in this area, this whole Balkan, Greece, Turkey area, essentially continues right on up to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I.